All right, thank you and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. Next slide, please. I'm Alistair Wood, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on regulatory issues and reliance in this time of COVID. Next slide. This webinar will build on the work done to produce the National Academies report on the use of mutual reliance amongst regulators of medical products, produced by a study committee which I chaired. That report can be downloaded at no charge from the National Academy website, and the web address will be shown on the slides throughout this meeting. Next slide. This topic was of interest before we started this. This topic was of interest some time ago, and it has only increased since COVID. It's increased enormously since then, and perhaps that is best reflected by the fact we have 1,032 registrants for this meeting from more than 30 countries. That's truly an amazing international response, reflecting worldwide interest. You've all received the agenda for today's webinar. Basically, it will consist of a series of short presentations followed by a panel discussion. Because of the number of participants, we obviously cannot have the direct interactions that we might have preferred, and instead we'll ask you to submit your questions that you have for the speakers or the panelists using the Q&A feature of the Zoom system. And we'll try our best to get to as many of them as we can during the panel discussion. This slide shows the study context as we had it when we first conceived this study. It was written and presented in this format. We recognized that globalization was an issue. People, diseases, and medicines cross borders, and boy, did we not recognize that in quite the extent to which we've recognized it now. Global pharmaceuticals, I think we've gone one slide too many, Hannah. Go back one. Thank you. Global pharmaceutical supply chains spanned borders and included countries and settings which had much weaker oversight than others. The complexity of medicines was increasing, but patients and consumers throughout the world were demanding similar access to medicines globally. Next slide, please. We published our report in late 2019. Within 2 months, COVID was spreading throughout the world. And before COVID, this topic might have appeared somewhat esoteric and of interest only to a limited number of regulators. However, after COVID, it's become clear that mutual reliance among regulators is both essential and urgent. We've had numerous examples over the last 6 months of this: ineffective approved so-called PPE, invalid approved diagnostic tests, untested, unapproved therapies being used widely. All of which have highlighted the inadequacies in some cases of our regulatory processes and the need for us all to be able to share the resources that we've built up. Next slide, please. The report recognized two types of reliance: what I'll call horizontal or bidirectional reliance, where similarly resourced regulators rely on one another. Perhaps an example might be the EMA and the FDA. Unidirectional reliance, however, occurs where a less resourced regulator relies on a well-resourced regulator for its reviews. It has to have access, obviously, to the well-resourced regulator's reviews without restriction or removal of anything. The less resourced regulator, however, does not give up sovereignty and still has a responsibility for the final decisions about approvals. Next slide, please. Mutual recognition post-COVID has become much more urgent. Clearly, redundant and duplicative reviews are an unaffordable luxury for all of us. We're all exposed to the same global health risks, and for some novel therapies, I would cite, for example, mRNA vaccines, even the best resourced regulators have limited, if any, experience of approving such vaccines. Therefore, reliance will become essential amongst all of us. Otherwise, we'll engage in a competitive situation where people are trying to approve faster than others to get access to medicines. There are also lessons that we need to learn from the repetitive PPE problems in which we found ourselves in a situation where multiple regulators were approving PPE based on apparent approvals in other jurisdictions, which turned out to be problematic. Next slide, please. So our goals for today are that we want to help each other recognize the advantages of Reliance for well-resourced regulators and for less resourced regulators. And the advantages and usefulness of them are different for the two types of regulators. We'd like to try to identify the barriers to implementation and determine how we remove these barriers. We want to define how we move forward for the good of global public health. I'd emphasize that point again. When we wrote this report, it sounded almost excessive to say that this was something that would drive global public health. Now it's become clear that this is an essential part of global public health. Our timeline now is driven by the need to rapidly review new therapeutics for global health, including vaccines, but not just vaccines. I'd like now to move to session 1, which will be moderated by Murray Lumpkin, and let him introduce the speakers. Murray?
Thank you, Alistair. Next slide, please, Hannah. And I'd like to extend my welcome to all of you who have joined us here today. I think a lot of the interest in this is not only the topic, but the stellar panel that we have been fortunate enough to assemble to talk about regulatory reliance and reliance-based pathways and what they mean, and particularly what they perceive the barriers to be and what some of the solutions to that might be. I know all of you in the registration material have access to the biographies of these individuals. Clearly, they need no introductions, and we will not have introductions today in order to try to use our time most efficiently. But I do want to take this opportunity to thank them. Coming from many different parts of the world, it's obviously one of the good silver linings of the world we've existed in for the last 6 to 8 months, where we can get together without having to travel and have these kinds of sessions actually more efficiently than perhaps we were able to do them in the past. Next slide, please. In order that all of us who are participating today might at least be using the same terms and have, as close as we can, the same ideas of what we're talking about when we talk about regulatory reliance and reliance-based regulatory pathways. I thought I'd take just a couple of minutes here to hopefully get all of us on the same page. For those of you who have read the report of the National Academies on this topic, in that report, regulatory reliance was described as a 21st century best regulatory practice. That was not the first time that has ever been ascribed to regulatory reliance, but I think it does reflect the fact that around the world, globally, people are not arguing these days of should we or should we not use regulatory reliance. It is how do we do it? How do we make it more efficient? And in what situations do we do it? As Alistair pointed out, this is not a regulatory pathway that we ask low-income countries to utilize, and we do not ask high-income countries to utilize it. To the contrary, it can be used, and it is used, by both well-resourced and by less well-resourced regulators. And the whole idea here is that no matter what your level of resourcing as a regulatory agency, people realize they don't have the adequate resources to do everything that their parliaments and their people expect them to do. And so one of the challenges of managing a regulatory agency is to try to utilize your human resources and your financial resources so that you're utilizing them on regulatory activities that have the highest public health impact, not on performing what ultimately will be seen as a redundant regulatory activity already performed by a trusted agency. And I think it's also important to realize that agencies use these pathways for different reasons. As Alistair pointed out, sometimes an agency does have the expertise required, but they just don't have enough of it. And so they use it to increase the capacity or the amount of the expertise that they have at a given point in time. And then there are those agencies that do not have the requisite expertise for a certain activity. And this is a way that they can bridge that gap and get access, at least at that point in time, to the expertise they need. Next slide, please. Emer Cook, who will be talking in a few minutes, and her colleagues at WHO, I think have done us all a great service in trying to define for the global community what regulatory reliance is. And I'm not going to read this definition here. You all will have access to these slides, but I think there are some important concepts here, that this is the idea of taking into account and giving significant weight to assessments, including inspection reports, when an agency is making its own decision. And the fact that when using these reliance pathways, an agency remains independent, it remains responsible and accountable for its own decisions. And I love the way that Analia Porras from PAHO, I once heard her describe this, and she said, reliance is not outsourcing one's regulatory decision making. And I think we all believe that's a very important concept that the community at large has to realize when these kinds of pathways are utilized. And it's also a concept that can be used throughout the life cycle of a pharmaceutical product, in clinical trial applications and marketing authorizations, inspections, pharmacovigilance, variations, and many, many other regulatory tasks. Next slide, please. There are two things, though, that I think are critical and that also people don't often realize when they're talking about reliance and reliance-based pathways, and they've never been part of this. And one is that in order to use this, it's absolutely mandatory that the product that the relying agency is looking at, and that's going to be coming to their country, is the same product that the reference agency looked at, and that is being marketed or that will be marketed in that country. And by same, we mean that it's the same qualitative and quantitative composition, it's the same strength, it's the same pharmaceutical form for the same intended use. And most importantly, particularly when you're relying on another agency's inspection report, that it comes from the same manufacturing site and uses the same manufacturing process that the reference agency actually inspected. The other thing is that the relying agency needs to have access to the necessary documents, whether that's an assessment report or an inspection report, to allow them to rely on what the reference agency has done. And I think it'll be interesting as we discuss this during this time as to the barriers and the challenges to getting that documentation. And some of those, as we know, are the redaction and the fact that public assessment reports often are not helpful because of some of the data that are not included. Next slide, please. Now, these pathways can take various forms, and different agencies use different ones depending on their need. It might simply be work sharing, where, for example, an application is divided between different agencies, and they do their piece of it, they bring it together, and then they use those assessments to make their own decision. Or it could be a country has decided that a given product is one they need in their country and in their armamentarium. And basically what they're going to do is simply verify that the version that they're getting is indeed the same version that the reference country has and has assessed and authorized. There's sometimes a country might say, yes, I want to verify and make sure it's the same product, but I really need to make some assessments regarding not the safety, efficacy, and quality of the product, but Is it labeled appropriate for my country? Is it appropriate for my country's healthcare system? Is it appropriate for my country's population? Can I extrapolate the efficacy and the safety from the reference country to the situation in my country? And is it appropriate for transport, storage, and distribution in my country versus the transport and the storage conditions that were utilized in the reference country? Next slide, please. Hannah, can we have the next slide, please? Thanks. And then there is the situation, which is perhaps more frequent, where the relying agency is going to do an assessment, but they're going to do an abridged assessment, where they will rely on the documentation for various activities, whether it's an inspection report, whether it's a scientific assessment report. But in these abridged assessments, we normally believe it would involve some degree of additional assessment by a relying NDA, especially with coming up with the kind of benefit to risk profile and determining whether that's an appropriate benefit risk profile for their population. But in all of these, the idea is to save resources, both financial and human, by not performing redundant activities. And by doing that, letting these resources be used for other high priority public health regulatory activities that they cannot rely on others to do. And in doing so, they make the regulatory process not only more efficient, but more effective. Next slide, please. And then there's the issue of recognition. And sometimes this transposition between the word reliance and recognition gives people problem. I think most of us tend to think of recognition as kind of a subset of reliance-based pathways, that it is much more formal. It generally requires a legal underpinning, whereas some of the others that we've talked about are much more informal. And WHO, again, I think has helped here in the definitions that they are purporting globally here, is that here in this situation, you're actually recognizing the decision of the other country or the other agency. So it is much more of an outsourcing of one's regulatory decision making, either about an application in its whole entirety or just regarding that assessment or that inspection report, that you're taking it on its face value and saying it applies in my country exactly as if I had done it. My final slide, please. So with this as background, hopefully getting some of these nuances and some of these terms set so that we can have a common vernacular here today. These are kind of our questions to the panel. If indeed this is a 21st century best regulatory practice, why aren't they used more frequently? And what can we do to increase their use and thus make our regulatory systems more efficient and more effective and allow us to better use our human and financial resources? And as Alistair pointed out in his introduction, particularly in light of the current pandemic, are there some opportunities here that we can begin to use these pathways, perhaps in ways we've not done in the past or not felt we needed to do or had to do in the past? But maybe this is creating new opportunities for us to explore these pathways to see how we can use them. So with that, I would like to proceed on and ask our first panel member, Guido Rossi from the EMA, to share some of his thoughts with us. Guido, please.
Thank you, Mac. Thank you for this illustration. And both Mac and Alistair has pretty nicely introduced the issue and described what reliance is and what need to be. So I can go to the first slide, please, to the next slide. And I can certainly not give too much time to describe the reliance. Here I just use some key words that has been much better expanded by you. Of course, there is a need for the trust to make it happen. There should be some equivalence of capabilities. Has been explained very well that is bilateral, can be bilateral or unilateral. Transparency, of course, is the key word for the mutual trust and exchange of the information. But what I think is important to flag and to point out is that the benefit is done, everything for the benefit of patients, patient access, because ultimately it's a matter of efficiency, and wherever we have efficiency, of course, the patient can benefit and can access or can have the regulatory decision for their benefit, whether it's a withdrawal, not necessarily an authorization, but anything will certainly is aimed to benefit the patient. And indeed, you say one of the key questions you have asked is if the current crisis showed some opportunities. And here I can certainly say, for my privileged observation point as a chair of ICMRA of the coalition, that certainly this was the perfect opportunity to show the benefit of this. We experienced an unprecedented benefit of working together or relying on each other. We shared all our experience, our processes. There was a lot of unilateral buy-in of from many different colleagues, I would say, in this case. There has been a strong attempt to have a complete regulatory convergence, or we felt the need to have some common, to define common standard, common outcome, common wording, and common communication. The transparency reached an unprecedented level because we shared quite a lot beyond what is the ritual of the mutual of the agreement, the existing memorandum, and so far and so forth. And of course, EMA is also committed, and this consented EMA to restart the clinical trial publication. In a nutshell, we had 31 meetings so far on COVID, where the participation of regulator, even outside the coalition, took place. And this was definitely one of the first real tangible example of reliance, spontaneous reliance under the pressure of course, of the crisis. In the next slide, I would like just to take another example. We have a mutual recognition agreement between EMA and US. And this implementation is showing what is needed, is trying to answer, to address the question of what is needed. Well, there is an incredible willingness from the parties to progress on this and to really have this exchange done, and for the inspection, for example, to really rely on each other. And there is a lot of trust at the high level. What is the still needed to progress faster and to take this example to progress globally? Well, sometimes we invoke the legal framework, sometimes we over-interpret the legal framework, sometimes the people are just not comfortable with a slightly different process. We don't need to deeply change the process. We need a little bit to adapt the process. There is no need of complete harmonization. So there is what I say in the shortest possible way, a little bit of cultural change at the operational level many times. That is very important. The other factor, in this example, we didn't need the patient organization, the patient said, even if the reliance on the inspection on both sides of the ocean is for their benefit, was mostly concerning regulator and industry. For many other processes, we might need the support of patients, and they might consent us to progress quite fast. Additional barriers, of course, I say the obvious, but the political pressure and the national approaches. But among colleagues, even not official reliance, but exchange of information, COVID showed how much we can benefit of this. I see the yellow card approaching in 1 minute. The next slide, I don't need to go through all the slide. The next slide, please. But this is just to mark what Mac already said very, very well. Is not to giving up any sovereignty, is not to delegate another authority, is simply to use common tools, to use common guidelines, to use similar processes. Because also we acknowledge that several different assessments might also benefit for the best interpretation of the science. And this is our experience with 2 rapporteurs before we get to an opinion. And I stop here before the red card will come. Thank you. Over to you, Mac.
Thank you, Guido. And you were under 7 minutes by 5 seconds. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. I'd like now to ask Emer Cook from WHO to talk about her perspectives on this. Please, Emer.
Thank you very much, Mac. Thank you very, very much, Guido. Thank you very much, Alistair. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the National Academy, but also to all the participants, because I actually haven't spoken at a webinar where we'd more than 1,000 participants before. So I feel really honored. The theme of this session was regulatory reliance, if not now, when? And I think this is very, very important at this point in time. Next slide, please. Reliance is not a new concept by any means, and it's been part of the European pharmaceutical legislation since at least 1972, and I know Guido just mentioned the mutual recognition agreement with the US, but actually there is a mutual recognition agreement on GMP with Australia and the EU, which dates back to 1998. That's 22 years and no problems on GMP recognition in that context. We at WHO have been working using reliance principles for most of our regulatory activities because, 1, we don't have the resources to do everything. 2, we have a lot of cooperation with regulators across the world. And 3, we find that it's very efficient and it helps us to, it helps access to medical products across the world. So we use reliance principles for many of our pre-qualification operations, but we also have a procedure whereby we ask regulators to rely on what WHO has done, and this is called the collaborative registration procedure. We set that up in 2014, and we now have over 40 countries signed up to this, and these countries now will rely on the pre-qualification decisions. We've over 500 national authorizations that have relied on pre-qualification decisions since 2014. And the timing has changed from registration based on pre-qualification from a period of 2 years to 10 years to an average of 90 days. That is a huge change. So we're always looking for opportunities as to how we can use reliance. We have published a guidance on desktop inspections that allows us to rely on inspections from other authorities through looking through critically looking at the full inspection reports. And we have, in 2017, we set up a national control laboratory network which uses concepts of Reliance for sharing of lot release data on vaccines. And we now have more than 40 competent authorities signed up to this. Next slide, please. So even if it's not new, it's still very, very important that institutions like the National Academies highlight the importance of regulatory reliance. We need to keep talking about reliance. We need to keep making it happen. We've also started to work with the International Pharmaceutical Regulatory Program members, and we actually did a survey in October 2018 of all the reliance concepts that are used by the regulators who participate to the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program. We got responses from 17 regulators. All of them used reliance to some extent. And we got some very good ideas, new concepts, some new ideas, and we're just about to do a new publication based on the survey that was put forward. And this also helped us to start work with the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities that Guido has just told us so much about, and all the important work that ICMRA is doing in this area. Mac referred to the definition, the WHO definition of reliance. This is part of our good reliance practice guideline that we have is out for consultation at the moment. We put it out earlier this month, and the deadline is the 18th of September. We're expecting this will be adopted in October. And at the moment, we are working very, very hard to promote reliance concepts in the context of our work on facilitating access to COVID-19 treatments, diagnostics, and vaccines. Next slide, please. But you asked us about what the barriers are. And I think that like everything, it's easy to talk about reliance and it's easy to write about reliance, but actually performing reliance in practice is much more difficult. And some of this is down to the basic regulatory frameworks, because most of the frameworks were built without concepts of reliance. They were built as national regulations, and they date back to the early 1960s. So even if you have a national regulatory framework, you may not have the capacity within your regulatory framework to rely on the decisions made by others. So we have to move from the concept of national regulatory thinking to cooperative thinking. And this is not something that we just do at a national regulatory level. It also has to be translated into the economic and public health thinking. So one of the first challenges that I would identify is, does it fit within the regulatory framework? Now, at WHO, we're working with less mature regulators and making sure that they have the possibility to build reliance concepts into their systems. But some of the more mature regulatory authorities might not have that, and that might be a barrier. Next slide, please. The second barrier I would like to focus on is the idea, the competencies and the mindset. It's easier not to rely. It's easier just to do your job and work away and do your job the way you've always done it. And if you're a regulator, you're thinking nationally. Generally, you're thinking about the protection of your patients. You're thinking about what matters in the context of your national environment. And you're not thinking about a global context. You're not thinking that an additional requirement that you might put in might actually add a cost to the healthcare system. you're not thinking that some national requirement might actually have an impact on shortages in your country, because you're just thinking about how you can best protect your national population. So to think in a way that where you think actually how is this going to impact on regulation globally means that we have to change our way of thinking. Next slide, please. I've already got a red card and I didn't even see the yellow card. So Guido already spoke about transparency. I'm not going to talk about that, but I do want to just, just mention one thing, and that's the last point on this slide, which I can't even see at the moment. And it's just that sometimes we don't have the time. It's easier to do your normal day job, and we don't have the time to think about how to build reliance into our concepts. So I see that as an important barrier as well. So that's it. I have one more slide, if I was allowed, which is really about how we make it happen in practice. And I want to just focus on the last point on this slide, where it really means that we need leadership at the highest level, but we also need that leadership to be translated into practical, pragmatic steps at the operational level if we're going to make this happen. And I do apologize for over passing my time. Thank you.
No problem. Clearly all very, very important points. And I think, we can come back to many of them during the panel discussion, because you do bring up the very real issues of how do we get those who actually do the reviews and have to take responsibility for the reviews to see this as something that is helpful to them, and is not an added burden, but actually hopefully is reducing the burden. Thanks again, Emer. I'd like now to turn to Janice Burnett from the IFPMA to get some of industry's view on this. Please, Janice.
Thank you, Mac, and thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity today. And I think I'd like to start at this coming from a little bit, maybe a step back, a bit of a broader view and perspective, but yet very similar to, I think, some of the elements that both Guido and Emer have mentioned. Next slide, please. So I think, when looking and asked about current barriers, I think from our perspective, there's three questions that really need to be looked at. And for us, these questions are, what exactly is regulatory reliance? We've seen today, to get us on the same page, and Mac did a great job, but we've seen today, what is it? And it's a full spectrum. It can start from unilateral regulatory reliance all the way over to mutual recognition. And I think that's where some of the confusion is with the broader stakeholders, that you hear regulatory reliance and maybe you automatically think mutual recognition, which is not always so easy to attain. So I think there's some confusion there, and we need to look at how we project what regulatory reliance really means, and then looking at where potentially could a national regulatory authority begin with implementing regulatory reliance. Where do you start? I think it could be very daunting, whether you're a smaller national regulatory authority or quite a large one. Where do you begin? How do you look at your processes? What do you want to do first, and how do you come up with such a plan? And then I think also, to whom do you talk to? Are there other national regulatory authorities who are interested in doing this? What documents do you need to share? How do you share that? Whom should you rely upon? These are all questions that we need to take forward and really look at what are the rules for engagement. Next slide, please. So I think it easily follows that, looking at this in the simplistic overview, what I have on the slide here is the areas where I think we really need to move forward. And again, what is regulatory reliance? What is the awareness and sensitization on the actual topic itself? And it's not necessarily just for national regulatory authorities, WHO, and industry. It's also sensitization for healthcare professionals, for patients, as Professor Razi mentioned. And in order to build maybe that grassroots support for implementing regulatory reliance, ensuring that the Ministry of Health and others are aware of how important this actually is to the future of regulation overall. Alignment, Emer mentioned the fact that there's an ongoing public consultation for good reliance practices, and we think this is key. Obviously, as an industry in IFPMA, we are commenting on the documentation like we normally do, but this will provide stakeholders, NRAs, and others with a framework, with a document written down. What is good reliance? What are good reliance practices? How can you take it forward? Some examples, and really would encourage WHO, the WHO regions, and the country offices to take that guidance and focus on implementation, having those workshops with NRAs where in a safe space they can discuss ways to take this back home and implement. And along with that, when an NRA wants to take regulatory reliance on board, whether it's looking at a verification program or more focused on work sharing, pilot programs to us would be key. Then you can start a process, time limited, see how it's going, and then involve stakeholders and stakeholder feedback so everybody moves with you as you go forward. And I think lastly, looking at this in the context of COVID-19, as Emer mentioned, just, maybe there's an issue with time, and maybe there's a thought that, when you're in COVID, maybe starting during a pandemic is maybe not the best, but I think you should look at that at the opposite side, that perhaps because we are in a global health pandemic, regulatory reliance is key to us ensuring that we have access to therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics as they come along. And as Guido mentioned, ICMA and WHO have been really good in facilitating the broader exchange and discussion during COVID-19. It doesn't mean they weren't good before, but I think there's just been, because of the pandemic, that enhanced communication with membership beyond ICMA itself. And I think, where you can learn from each other, have those best practices are really key. So in closing, just want to say that as IFPMA, we're very supportive of regulatory reliance. We do think there is a role for industry. I'm sure we'll get into more details around this as the panel progresses today. But just want to emphasize that dialogue is key on this, and look forward to the discussion. And thank you, Mac, and the organizers for allowing me to participate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. I'd now like to ask Mikel Arriola, who was the former head of the Mexican National Regulatory Authority, and under whose watch a great deal of reliance-based regulatory pathways were implemented in Mexico. So, Mikel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mac. Good morning to everyone. Please, the following slide. I'm going to talk about the results of Reliance in my experience in Mexico. Mexico was the country before 2011 that lasted longer periods of time in order to authorize a new molecule. And that was generating huge problems in terms of access, because prices were very high and the molecules were scarce. So the poorest people in Mexico were paying more for their medicines. So we relied on FDA, Health Canada, and Japan. And we were able to reduce the time of authorization from 360 days to 60 days. And that generated a direct benefit for Mexicans, because we could issue 336 new molecules in Mexico. And now if you compare prices in Mexico before and after, you could say that you can buy a new molecule in Mexico in 60 or 70% less of the price than the US. So that's a great result of Reliance. Also, we were having backlog in terms of authorization of protocols for clinical trials. So we decided to rely on other countries, and we were capable of reducing these numbers from 3 months to 1 month, and that generated also results. Mexico has been the first market for commercialization of new molecules in several occasions. So that's obviously benefiting millions of Mexican consumers. The following slide, please. The economic benefits of this reliance in Mexico are very clear. We increase the supply of medicines and the availability of new molecules by means of R&D, and we accumulated from 2013 till 2018 savings of around $900 million US. I was general director of the main provider of health in Mexico, the Mexican Institute of Social Health and Social Security, and we were able to save millions, billions of pesos through this strategy, and we were able to expand the portfolio of treatments in our country. Also, in macroeconomic numbers, from 2008 to 2017, out-of-pocket spending in Mexico has decreased from 48%, which is very high, to 41% due to this kind of policies. So that's the result of Reliance. And I want to make a proposal today in the following slide, which is based on Reliance in order to face the COVID. May I have the next slide, please? This proposal is related to COVID-19 vaccines. And the context is that the competition for access to the COVID-19 vaccine among countries will exacerbate during 2020-21, considering that the demand of this product in the world is much greater than the production capacity. Currently, there are around 25 very important COVID vaccine projects developing in phases 1 to 3. Some of them are hosted by countries which agencies are not familiarized with the authorization of new vaccines, such as Russia and China. So these projects could satisfy the world demand only in the case that they successfully complete phase 3 of their clinical trials. However, if they are authorized only by their local agencies, access for other countries will face high transaction costs and will limit the recovery of the world economy, expanding poverty and inequality. I have to underline that today, health agencies in the world are playing the most important roles of their institutional lives. And if the agencies work together, could resolve the greatest problem of mankind in the last 100 years. So now Reliance is a tool in order to recover normality for humanity. So my proposal is that WHO should incorporate urgently a COVID-19 vaccine joint review panel, adopting international best practices and human expertise in order to grant global authorizations by means of which every health agency in the world should grant an immediate local commercialization permit. This is the only path in order to recover normality after these phase 3 trials, the successful trials are recognized by the world. So let me end with that. This is urgent. We have to have a joint review process, including best practices, FDA, the European Medicine Agency, the we could say the most renowned agencies will have to sustain this effort. However, if a vaccine is approved or authorized or recommended by this international body, that vaccine should enter to the other countries that do not have capacity, the sufficient capacity to authorize vaccines, and will not have this capacity through this year or the following year. Matt, that is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikel. And perhaps this is something that clearly we can take up in the panel, especially with Emer, on what WHO is doing and thinking in this respect, particularly with the emergency use listing procedure they have, and really dealing with the question you point out about the multiplicity of vaccines and trying to figure out which versions of which vaccines are going to actually end up in a given country and how best to help that country get access as quickly as possible. Thanks again, Mikel. And now, last but surely not least, I want to talk to Peggy Hamburg and ask her, as all of you know, she is the former Commissioner of Food and Drugs in the United States. And so, Peggy, I'll turn it over to you at this point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mac. I really appreciate being part of this panel and joining such a distinguished group of friends and colleagues, and also friends and colleagues at the National Academy of Medicine. And thanks for all the great work you've done on this and related topics, and for sponsoring this event. It surely is an important time to be having these discussions. And I will try to be brief so we can get on to the Q&A, because there is so much to discuss. Mac began by sort of helping us remember the definition of reliance and framing many of the important aspects of it, and we've continued that discussion. I'm going to take the liberty now of not being in an official role to be a little bit broader in my comments. For me, regulatory reliance is an essential element of a broader collaborative approach to the regulatory process, and really it is part of the critical engagement and collaboration of regulatory authorities to enhance and extend regulatory reliance activities, but also other activities of convergence, harmonization, alignment, to ensure that there are systems for enhanced communication, data sharing, transparency, and opportunities for shared discussion and decision-making regarding current issues and emerging concerns, and really developing collaborative strategies to address shared issues, big and small. And I think this is crucial for routine activities. It is the case that no regulatory authority, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how large, no matter how well funded, can actually take on all the responsibilities that it needs to in our modern world. There really is a need for global collaboration and shared activity and responsibility. And certainly in a crisis like the one we're currently experiencing, this becomes even more pronounced. Without a doubt, the COVID global pandemic has reminded us that in our globalized world, people, disease, and medical products cross borders, that science is a global enterprise. The biopharma industry certainly crosses borders in terms of its products, and many of the companies, in fact, are multinational. The global pharmaceutical supply chains and medical product supply chains are very complex and span many countries, ones that are strong in regulatory oversight and ones that are weak. There's an urgent need for access to medical products, as well as an urgent need to accelerate the the biomedical product innovation so that we can better deliver on available science and technology to address unmet public health and medical needs. The products are increasingly complex, and patients and consumers appropriately are really demanding equitable access to these vital medicines globally. And in the context of COVID-19, it also is truly a public good to ensure appropriate, equitable, and public health driven distribution, as well as to ensure the quality and appropriate use of medical products. So things we knew before have been brought into intense focus in the COVID crisis, and I think have really made us recognize that all regulatory authorities are stronger and better able to do their jobs for their citizens if there is the context and acceptance of this kind of global regulatory collaboration, importantly, including Reliance. The barriers are real, though. I mean, I know, having worked hard on these issues with many of the people on the panel and with, excellent guidance and support from Mac Lumpkin, who was at the FDA then and really tutored me in this set of issues and helped us to undertake, a lot of really important work to better position the agency in a globalized world. But the barriers are real. First of all, every country has a different legal regulatory framework to which they are bound. You have a responsibility as a regulatory authority to follow those rules, and they don't always align or harmonize with those of other countries. So learning how to work despite that, including working on modifying legislation, is a big task, and it takes time and focus. We also have to recognize that this moment in time is one where many countries are turning inward, and that includes attitudes about national regulatory authorities, and the kind of national focus is understandable. That's what the mandate is, and certainly in a context of a crisis like this, leaders have a responsibility to protect their citizens, but the solutions to most of the problems before us do require this kind of international collaboration and efforts to work together, including regulatory reliance. And we need to, work together despite this growing nationalism. Trust has been mentioned, and it is crucial. Not only do we have to be sure that even as we rely on other countries, our own citizens and policymakers will trust us as national regulatory authorities to do what's necessary for the citizens of that country, but also trust in the other regulatory authorities. And that is both an issue of openness, communication, transparency, and learning to work together and establishing systems to institutionalize those ways of working together. But it also has to do with capacity building, because you can't rely on another country's regulatory oversight if, in fact, that regulatory capacity is not mature enough to be able to take on the tasks. And even working with the European Union, that was an issue for the U.S. because not all countries, as we're trying to establish a system for regulatory reliance, not all countries within the EU have the same capabilities and track records for reliability. So those are issues to overcome as well. Obviously, there has to be a willingness to partner, and it does take time. Emer mentioned about how the competing priorities can get in the way of this. But at the end of the day, if we can keep focused and really lay out what needs to be done, how to do it, and the benefits, as Mikkel, so profoundly put forward for countries, but in big ways and small. But if we can do that, then I think it is easier to make the time, because it will make everyone's jobs easier over the longer time. And there are benefits for the regulatory authorities as they try to do their increasingly complex and demanding jobs. Industry clearly has a vested interest because the more alignment and reliance there is, the less duplication of effort, and that saves time and money. And it also, ultimately, as Guido said, is about serving the patients. And if we can do this, we can do a better job really delivering on the power of biomedical product innovation and the needs to deliver products cheaper, better, and more swiftly to people who need them. So I will stop there. And I know there'll be a very interesting discussion to come.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank all of you on the panel for really setting up what I think, as Peggy said, is going to be a very interesting discussion. So I will now turn this back over to our moderator, Alistair Wood, who's going to moderate the discussion. Alistair?
Thank you, Mac. Those have wonderful presentations and certainly help to articulate the problems here. I'm going to ask Jeff Drazen to begin the panel by commenting on how he thinks we can get the word out and how we square this political, scientific, and legal circle to get people persuaded to cooperate on this. And anything else he's heard that he'd like to comment on. Jeff?
Thank you, Alistair. They're very interesting presentations. And to me, the topic line here, if not now, when, for those of you who don't know, was derived from the Jewish scholar Hillel, who was asked to explain the Torah, which is a very complex book, to someone while that person was standing on one foot. And he said that one of the key things is, if not me, who? And if not now, when? And everything else in the Torah was explanation of those two things. So what it means is it's a very complex issue. You're trying to boil down to the simplest common denominator. And to me, that's trust. We have, for this to work, there needs to be trust in the systems mutually, that each of the regulatory agencies, the ones that you are using for Reliance, are ones whose decisions are based entirely on the science, and that you can trust the issues that have been brought forward as being scientifically valid, that a decision has not been made because of an underlying political agenda. And I would have said up until 2016 that there was really solid agreement around the world that drug regulatory agencies were making their decisions on the best available science. And what we've seen, sadly, at least in the United States, is that they've become political. The drug regulatory agency is doing its job the best it can, but at the top, there has been an issue to try to make the decisions of that agency less reliable in two very different but related ways. First, we erode trust by having some of our leaders say, don't worry about the agency, I have a better idea. And by virtue of the power invested in that person to make such a statement, many people believe it. And then when it turns out that that idea was not only not efficacious, but in fact dangerous, trust in the agency which made that political decision is then eroded. And being able to use that decision for international decision-making is also eroded. And so I think that for this to work, the agencies making these decisions need to be able to show not only to their populations, but to the world at large, that they're making decisions based entirely on the scientific evidence. Now, sometimes the evidence isn't so clear. One of the things I learned with my 19 plus years at the New England Journal is the cutting edge evidence is never clear. You think of cutting edge as sharp, but usually there are lots of questions. And making those questions something that people can understand, appreciate, and then use in making their individual decisions is very important, but you need to know that each of those decisions was based on the science. So one of the things that I'm concerned about in this, trying to move things forward, is have we, through COVID-19, through the need for speed, eroded trust, and by eroding trust, made our task more difficult? I don't really know the answer. I have some suspicions about it. And now if we think, because one of the underlying things, the elephant in the room here, is the COVID-19 vaccine. And if the first vaccines in clinical trials are allowed to go to their end, like the one, the Moderna trial is being event-driven. And if we get the requisite number of events before the US election, even though the science is pristine, will people think that it was driven by a political agenda? Or opposite, if the science was there and not? So this is one of the issues that I don't know how to resolve, but it's certainly one that we can't ignore. I know there are ways to make it go away, but I can't make that happen. But when we think about the vaccine, if you have a vaccine that's 90%, 95% effective and has few side effects, then what happens in the first set of trials? Will people believe that and stop the other trials? Does clinical equipoise go away for the people who are in trials with a second vaccine when a first vaccine is shown to be very effective? Do we have that degree of trust? Do we want the variability to be out there? And so I think that we need to be able to work together so that we don't duplicate efforts, so that we can move things through quickly. But all of that is based on a foundation of trust. And one of my concerns, and one of the questions I like to ask the panel is my view as a citizen from the northeastern part of the United States, which is not really thought to be one of the major supports of our current government, jaundiced? In fact, does the FDA still have the trust and reputation that it had since the passing of the Estes-Kefauver Acts in the 1960s as the world's premier agency? Has that trust been eroded? And because of that trust, do other agencies such as the EMA take over? Or has this eroded trust in regulatory authorities at large? So that's my question to the panel, because for any of this to work, we have to believe that the decisions that are being made on the best interest of the people at large, on the best science available.
Maybe that's a question for Peggy, right?
Well, I can start, but others probably should answer. But, you know, it's such an important question. And this is, you know, really, to be frank, a disturbing time, because the scientific integrity and trust and confidence in regulatory authorities is absolutely crucial to their ability to do their mission. And all of the stakeholders involved, I think, want to support that, you know, whether it's industry or patients or the academic research community, the scientific community. You know, the people that really understand what is at stake here don't want politics intruding into decision making. There is, of course, the belief that, you know, many across different domains of life, you know, may have, that in a crisis, anything is better than nothing, but it's not hard to explain that, in fact, even in the kind of serious circumstance we find ourselves in, or even if you have a life-threatening disease, a drug that doesn't work can actually harm you and may also prevent you from getting a treatment that does work. Or with a vaccine, in the context of COVID, a vaccine that doesn't work will put people at risk for infection. It may lead them to think they're protected and actually take greater risks and become more vulnerable. And certainly when you're giving a vaccine to people that are already healthy, but trying to protect them from disease, you have a special obligation to ensure safety. So there is a lot at risk here. And superficially, people may say, what's the harm of getting something out there quickly if there's nothing else? But there are harms, there are risks, and I think we understand it, and we have to do a better job at communicating about that. But I still have great confidence in the scientific teams that are undertaking the review of these products. I always viewed the job of the commissioner to protect and insulate from political intrusions. But what's happening now to me is a reinforcing argument for the importance of the global regulatory community, because these decisions are so important and have such broad implications that they need to be made in an open, transparent way with data sharing with all stakeholders, and other regulatory authorities need to be part of the discussions and have been part of discussions about regulatory standards. You know, one of the things that I think was very encouraging in COVID-19 response was the way both the scientific community mobilized, the R&D community, but the regulatory authorities through ICMRA and other entities, and many of the people that are on this panel leading the way, really sat down to sort of say, what are the critical questions that have to be asked and answered as these studies go forward? How can we structure the studies so they get us the answers we need as quickly and reliably as possible? What are the areas where we need to have common approaches so that information from different studies can be shared, and then working closely as the research unfolds to ensure appropriateness of the clinical trial designs, the both scientific integrity and the ethical integrity of the clinical trials. And then ultimately, I think we need to have an enormous amount of openness, transparency, and discussion about the data as we move towards these important decisions.
Can I?
Let me, go ahead. Mikhail?
Well, just a point of view from a country which is not used to authorize innovation. We are a country, an importer of new molecules and vaccines. What is our main worry now towards the vaccine is access. We trust in a couple of very important agencies, FDA, and that's why the confidence in FDA should not be eroded by the political process, and the European Medicines Agency, and quite a few others. So what we have to do as a secondary market maybe is to guarantee access for the highest volume we can have. So we are trusting that in November, maybe we could have, as a world, positive results of 3 or 4 projects. And we are pre-buying vaccines in order to guarantee the access for our population. So the role of the agency in Mexico should be now pursuing the entrance for access for the most vaccines we can. I think that's the point of view, and we are trusting now entirely in what's going on with FDA. So Jeffrey is right. If the science base of FDA erodes, we're gonna have a problem because we won't have access. And let me end my comment here is, if we don't have an equal access to the vaccine as a world, the inequality gap will expand. And that is in hands of the regulators. It is not in hands of the IMF or the World Bank or the financial institutions. Now, expanding or not expanding that inequality and poverty gap depends on regulators, health regulators.
Can I raise an issue that's come up with a number of people that I think is critical here? I think we all agree that we want to see rapid access to effective and safe vaccines, particularly, ignoring other issues just for the moment. But Amir and Mac both raised issues that I think people don't, outside of the panel, may not fully understand. Like, for example, the assumed to be identical vaccine manufactured in different places may not be the same vaccine. So how do we ensure that a vaccine approved, let's say, for the sake of argument, by the EMA or the FDA, that Mikel might want to approve for Mexico, is indeed the same vaccine, is indeed the same product, and how do we make sure that that's true? Now, we have a self-interest, it seems to me, here with vaccines that we've never had before with other medical products, in that if ineffective vaccines or even unsafe vaccines are used in other places in the world, people who believe themselves to be immune to the infection are going to enter the US or Europe and infect people. And or they will, if they're shown to be unsafe, will undercut the ability of us to vaccinate people in this country. So we have a very poor system at the moment for ensuring that we're talking about the same product, largely manufactured in countries which may have poor regulation. How are we going to ensure that Mikel knows that he's getting the vaccine that's been approved by the FDA, manufactured on the same production line, manufactured in the same factory, and manufactured to the same quality?
Well, it can't happen, Alistair. I mean, no single place can make 6 billion doses, right? So it's going to have to spread, right? So someone is going to at some point you're going to have to take it on faith that if the same process was used, the same materials were used. Otherwise, you're going to have to do clinical trials to compare vaccines from different sources. Do we have that kind of? We have the resources to do that?
Well, the quality of manufacture is something that is generally the thing that can be granted, because if it's a big company, I do not believe that they will market a different quality in different regions of the world. That's, I don't think, is going to happen. From different companies, it might be that there are different vaccines with different quality, but that is another issue.
Matt, do you want to comment on that? You have a lot of experience in less resource countries.
Well, actually, I think we should call on Emer, because I mean, this is really what WHO and the pre-qualification program was created to do, was to deal with products that the safety, efficacy, and quality has not been assured by the more stringent regulatory authorities. So Emer, please, I'm sure you guys at WHO are looking at this and have some ideas on how to answer this question.
Thank you very much, Mark. And yeah, it's a very important question, and it's something that I think that everybody's looking and highlighting the risks. But there's so much transparency, or so much potential transparency, and so much realization of the risks of differences that I am confident that the systems will capture the comparability issues and make sure that these are addressed prior to marketing. Now, I wanted to come back to some of the issues that were raised during the discussion about transparency and what WHO can do. And what you're going to see in the next couple of weeks is we will do a call for expression of interest for vaccines to be emergency use listed, or to check eligibility for whether or not they could be assessed by WHO. Part of that expression of interest will require the manufacturers to share the data that they have submitted to other regulators and to agree that we can share the data with other regulators across the world. Now, that's something we haven't done before, and I think that's something that's really going to make a difference. I think we have to, as a global community, we have to stand up and be counted. We can't hide behind the confidentiality, the trade secret information. We have to be confident in the products that we're getting, in the assessments that are being done, if we're going to ask other people to rely on them. We can't ask them to rely on a black box. So I think that's something that we have to start changing the world to make this a reality. And I'm very positive about this. I see a lot of interest. We've seen an unprecedented development in the COVID-19 vaccine area. We've seen unprecedented cooperation. We're looking at allocation. WHO is in charge of trying to make sure that these vaccines are actually, they reach every country in the world. We're working on an allocation policy to make this happen. I've never seen that happen before. And I'm really confident that we're going to, that we'll all step up to the mark and be able to ensure that we have independent science, safe and effective products, because if we don't, we all suffer. If we do, we all gain.
Alistair, I would like to ask the panel the other side of the comparability question. I mean, the manufacturing quality is one, but the other thing we hear in our work in low-income countries and talking with low-income country regulators is a question of science that they are raising and saying, look, if all of the data that shows the clinical efficacy and safety of these products comes from Europe and North America, how do we know it is relevant and applicable to our populations where we have high incidences of HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, malnutrition, all things that we know suppress the immune system? And if the safety and efficacy is really looked at by populations that don't suffer generally in the same way from these kinds of immune suppressants, how do we answer this question of, is this vaccine going to perform in our population the same way it did in the others? And I'd love to hear what the panel says about that particular kind of science issue. Thanks.
Right. That's a fascinating question. Who would like to step in first for that?
Well, maybe in a pragmatic point of view, I think that the capacity to receive clinical trials in a country is very important. So if you can, as a country, try to incentivize clinical trials, phase 3, and deregulate that, obviously guaranteeing security, the safety, that could be a good way to handle that problem, Murray, and to include the population from your country in those clinical trials.
I guess some of the vaccine trials have migrated to less resourced countries because that's the place that has the high frequency of cases now, Brazil, for example. Other comments on that?
Yeah, well, I think these epidemics, meanwhile, Mac, this is generally a very, very good question. Maybe for this vaccine is less severe, the situation, because as Alistair was saying, the pandemic is flaring up in countries, and the development of vaccine is kind of following where the infection is spreading faster. So in some way, this specific vaccine, round of vaccine, probably will not have that question as a main issue. But unfortunately, it's limited to this. The question will bounce back for the next development.
But there is a sort of a related subset of your question, I think, in terms of we do need to make sure, well, the vaccine will be tested, as Guido said, and others, where the disease is. And I don't think there's a lot of reason to be concerned about that, as long as the studies are held to appropriate scientific and ethical standards. There is an important aspect of making sure that all of the subpopulations of people who will need to get this vaccine are actually part of the testing. So we understand, for example, how the vaccine or vaccines work in the very elderly patients who we know don't have as strong an immune response, or it will ultimately be used in children. Right now, children aren't part of the clinical studies, at least the ones that are US sponsored, but we've got to figure out how to bridge to those populations of pregnant women. So, these are complexities of science. But again, these are questions where I think regulators all benefit by working together and having common strategies and thinking through these issues together.
A good example is Brazil. Brazil is exchanging patients for doses. They are receiving clinical trials of around 4 projects, China, Europe, and the US. And they are receiving a huge amount of vaccines in exchange for population in these trials. And another good example now in Latin America is a project of AstraZeneca. They are manufacturing the antigen in Argentina, and we will terminate in Mexico the process. So there you have 150 million doses available for Latin America. And the tragedy now is positive for us because we have high rates of infection and we could offer lots of patients for clinical trials.
Maybe if I could just talk about the strategic advisory group of experts on immunization at WHO, because precisely these issues about how the utility of the products in different populations, in different environments, it's something that will affect how WHO recommends that the products will be used in populations. And this is something that is going hand in hand with the regulatory process. It's not part of the regulatory process, but we have to make sure that we're looking at the policy implications as well as the regulatory implications. And all these questions of populations, immunosuppressed individuals, all these are part of the overall decision making there.
Amir, is it your impression that different jurisdictions will permit the same submission for each jurisdiction? In other words, will companies end up going through the usual dance of a different submission for each jurisdiction for approval, which is incredibly time-consuming and wasteful, or will they, in this special situation, be prepared to accept a single submission?
Well, all I can do is make a big plea to regulators across the world to accept a single submission and to work together. I think this is it's one of the issues I try to refer to in my opening remarks. I think we all believe we should do that, but at the moment, the submissions are going to individual regulators, and they have their individual timelines and obligations. And it's harder to get us all to work together than it is to work on an individual basis. But my plea to the world, to the regulators across the world, is that we do accept one single submission, that we do share information, that we do have a platform for sharing assessments, because I think this is really the only thing that makes sense.
Well, could I ask if 2 former regulators or 3 former regulators here, whether they think that's likely? Peggy?
Well, you might want to start with Guido, who's actually a sitting regulator, but I think that, again, the law requires a specific submission to different regulatory authorities. and there are differences in what is asked for as a result. But I think that my sense is, and I am at a distance from this now, that there has been more of an effort now to try to align, what would be in the dossiers for the vaccine product approval, and the recognition, of course, that vaccines are going to be going to different places. There certainly has been discussion, not in the middle of this crisis, but before, about moving towards more common application packages and protocols, but it does take time to achieve that. But I would say I have a perspective on it, but you've got the opportunity to hear from the horse's mouth, as they say.
I think that's you, Guido.
Yeah, I cannot escape. Well, I think this time to have a single submission is not, I think it's not possible. What is doing, there are two speeds. One is the informal attempt to have a common standard and to go in parallel, both in time and in the approach and the methodology. And this is done in many fora, is not only in the ICMRA, but daily with our colleagues of FDA. But here we come to one comment from Jeffrey, and is the trust. So if we introduce the variable of the politics, first, this is an answer to Jeffrey. Yes, if it's undermined the credibility of FDA, all the word of regulators will be undermined. Even if we kind of distance ourselves, our credibility will be damaged if the credibility of each one of us is damaged. So for this specific case, I expect that there will be at least two submissions to FDA and to EMA. Behind the scene, we will work together. Officially, should be two different processes. Will be two different processes, not only to be appeared. Are two different processes with slightly maybe different requirement. That is the reality.
Right, and that is the reality, and it's one of the great frustrations that Amir expressed, and actually the committee that I chaired expressed, that we all agreed that we should move towards a single system, but nobody could see how it could ever occur because of the reasons that Peggy discussed, the political history, the legal history, the legal requirements being different. But surely now, if we're faced with this, we can see the advantages of it. We're now past, sorry, go ahead, Guido.
An element of optimism. Do not underestimate the work that is done behind the scene by the,
yes.
Don't underestimate, because it is huge and is productive.
Right. Yes, and in fact, we're past our time, but we heard that repeatedly, that informal reliance was very important, and that required trust, of course. If that trust is eroded, as Jeff says, then that informal cooperation can be eroded too. We're past our time, and this has been an incredibly useful and productive discussion, and one that could go on, I think, for a lot longer productively. And I want to thank all of our panelists for their contribution, all the speakers for their contribution, and for the people who've submitted questions, which we will try to get some of the panelists to respond to offline if we can get to later. And this has been really worthwhile. I think our job now should be to think about how we carry this forward and make some of the suggestions into a reality, so we don't find ourselves in this situation 5 years from now yet again. And on your behalf, I'll thank all of the speakers and panelists, and close with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.